Welcome to Short and to the Point, a podcast from the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Here's your host, Jessica Kleinschmidt.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Short and to the Point here on Awful Announcing and the Comeback. Jessica Kleinschmidt here. Bit of an emotional episode today, but in the best way. Eric Wahl, the brother of the late Grant Wahl, joined me today. We talked about Grant and his amazing, illustrious career. You, of course, know him. His byline is on some of the best journalism covering all sports, but mainly soccer. He just absolutely crushed soccer coverage. And he's legendary. My producer, Philip, not only met Grant, but he's one of those who says his coverage changed his life. He's a freaking legend. Even if you weren't a guy or a girl or a person who followed Grant's career, you just knew of him. I remember when soccer was reintroduced into my life, women's coverage, of course, was at the precipice of all of our obsession around the pandemic. And he was at the forefront of that. He unfortunately passed away. And, a lot of times we don't realize how important somebody is to our life until they are gone. Eric was promoting the latest book, World-Class Purpose, Passion, and the Pursuit of Greatness on and off the field. It's a collection of Grant's work from throughout his career. And he did the audio of that. That is out now. The foreword is done by his wife, Celine. And of course, she did such a fabulous job talking about Grant and everything that went down during his death and then afterwards as well. So without further ado, here is my chat with Eric Wahl. Eric, welcome to Short and to the Point. We were just chatting before you pressed record, and I'm so glad you're here. I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. I was so happy you asked.
Yeah, and before I pressed record, I was talking to you about researching this. It was such an honor for this podcast because it was like I was being reintroduced to your brother, the late Grant Wahl, and a lot of people describe him. He was such a special person. But then when you describe him, you talk about he's your confidant, best friend, your defender, your soundboard. So who was Grant to you?
All of those things, really. But I think if we're lucky, a relationship with a sibling develops and kind of changes over time. And there were definitely times, like growing up, he's this nerdy 4 years younger kid who, like, out the box thought he knew everything, and if he didn't, he take me to the library right now. It's like, dude, you're 3, chill out. And and then we went through a phase of just like doing what I think brothers do, like mom and dad came home from a walk. Why is Grant crying and his nose is black and blue? Well, he fell on the couch. So I mean, we were definitely sort of like regular that way, but I think we learned to appreciate each other more and more as we aged and kind of went our separate ways, but kept very similar kind of shared interests, telling stories, writing, teaching. And the past few years, especially just right before COVID hit, we had a lot of family stuff kind of wallop us all at once. We were stressed. Our parents entered hospice at the same time and had retired to Southern Arizona. I was living in Seattle. Grant was based in New York. And we had to move them from their home into assisted living. With a great amount of help from Celine, Grant's wife, Celine Gounder, and wanted to make a point of being able to check in on them as much as possible. So we were flying down every other month, trading off months, trying to take care of our parents' affairs, and made us really close. And we were in each other's orbit a lot more frequently than we had been in a long time, and realized that even though we'd always been good at like talking on the phone and texting and stuff like that, that we really missed each other's company. And our mom was super matter of fact about death and dying. She just had like an attitude I rarely see. And she would see that like Grant or I were upset about something. At a dinner once, I told her, "You cannot die before Dad does, because like I don't know how to deal with that." And she just like set me straight. And she said, "Well, I probably am. I'm 8 years
Yeah.
older than he is, and like here's the facts, and I don't feel bad about it, and neither should you." And I've wondered a lot about like, was she just doing this for show to make me feel better or not? But it worked. And mom passed away right during the Women's World Cup.
Wow.
Grant was in France. She'd been watching from her hospice bed. Um, and then our father, who had Parkinson's, we had to move him into a memory care unit. I think they call it a smaller room, and we made a point of visiting more regularly. But it was a lot of travel and a lot of worry, and then COVID hit, and our father didn't understand why he wasn't seeing his kids anymore. He just knew he
Wow.
wasn't seeing them, and so spent a lot more time talking with Grant, just about every day, about all kinds of things. And then when Dad passed away, um, the assisted living place where he was living gave us special permission to come see him. I'm so glad we were able to do that. But it would be almost another year entirely before we were able to go down and take his ashes and scatter them up in the mountains where we'd scattered our mom's ashes. And we had this really, uh, oh, this is harder than I thought. We had this really deep conversation while we were hiking, about death and dying. And Grant said that he thought for a long time that after this he wouldn't have any reason to go back to Green Valley, Arizona, where they were living. And he thought, since we had put mom and dad's ashes in the same spot, that he would. And this was the May before he died, and I think about that a lot.
Mm.
And um, I mean, especially because it's the same month right now, and
Yeah.
we don't know what's going to happen, right? And um, one thing I'm really grateful about is that Grant and I made a point of always, even if we were angry at each other, saying "I love you," signing off every conversation. And he knew that I was going through some uh, what would end up being a divorce, and with someone I'd been with for 18 years, and it's just a hard time all around. And I think the experience that we shared with our parents made us a lot closer. And even though we were rarely in the same time zone at the same time, um, we we kind of went the extra mile for each other. Our our father and his brother had more of an estranged relationship, and we didn't want that.
Mhm.
And um, if I was having any kind of problem, I knew I could call Grant. And in fact, Grant would chide me for not calling him enough.
Yeah.
But I was really going through it while I was in Seattle, when he first went to Qatar, and he even offered to leave the World Cup, um, and come to Seattle and stay with me. And that's the kind of person Grant was. Um, and in a strange sort of way, uh, I take comfort in knowing that he and people say this sometimes, and it's silly, but I think he died doing absolutely what he loved and where he wanted to be and doing what he wanted to do. And um, in these sort of interregnum, I guess, between the immediacy of his death and our ability to find out what had happened to him, um, I just went through a whole period of feeling really kind of crap, because I thought, well, I should have told him to come to Seattle, right? And I mean, we know now that what happened to him would have happened no matter where he was.
Yeah.
And there was nothing anybody could have done about it. No amount of CPR was going to help. And I'm so grateful that he wasn't driving a car or anything like that. And I'm honestly grateful that he wasn't with me in Seattle, because while some people wish they'd been like right there with a loved one's last moments, I don't think I would have handled that very well. And all of that time period in my brain, anyway, the past year or so, is very much kind of condensed, kind of the way a lot of people think about the pandemic also. It's like, yeah, there was a stretch of time, but now it's become like this phyllo dough kind of pressed event, and I can't necessarily suss out like which month was that, and it just kind of becomes this single kind of unit. And I went to New York and kind of bunkered down with Celine and Grant and Celine's place, and her amazing family was there through all of that. And we didn't watch the news or anything like that. We just kind of were in our own space time and helping each other. And we talked a lot, but that entire experience made my relationship with Celine much stronger. Even she made a point of saying, like, you are my family, you are my brother, and I want you to think of yourself that way. And it was dawning on me that like my entire family kind of just evaporated, and that'd be a lot for anyone. So it meant a huge deal to me. And knowing Grant as well as I did, he would be the first person apologizing to all of us. It's like, oh man, I'm so sorry. This is, well, first he'd say, this is so inconvenient for all of you. But it's not hard, I think, for people to imagine. Like, yeah, sometimes I get kind of tearful about stuff, but Grant wouldn't want that. He'd feel huge guilt about it, for one thing. But he really was the closest person to me. The like one person who knew my entire life, and like where I came from, why I reacted to things the way I did. But sometimes, well, not just sometimes, people often thought he was the older brother. At first, I think it was because of the hair situation, but
yeah. My brother and I are the same. He's younger, but he's definitely older. I get it. Yeah.
I think it was just like Grant was a very old soul in general, and like had a very, and I'm glad he was able to, but like had a very straight white male trajectory. That, I mean, not knocking it, like if you can, go, but saw that my life was not as easy. And I think that helped him place a framework around the stories he wanted to tell, knowing that not everyone, sorry, I'm shutting my cat up.
That's okay.
Knowing that not everyone, especially in sports, especially in soccer, gets where they are without difficulties, without obstacles. And as we grew up and got older, I think we came to have a really strong appreciation for our parents and what they went through to put us through school. I mean, when you're a kid, I had no idea that we were poor. I just thought like bologna and ketchup is what you put on a sandwich.
Yeah.
That, why wouldn't you think 7-Up is medicine? And our dad was a public school teacher, and mom was a gym teacher and then a counselor, but stayed home to raise her kids. And then, went through difficulties trying to get back into the workforce, as lots of women did and still do. But the degree to which Grant was like hyper observant of all of this phenomenon and how that worked, and our mom in particular was so benevolent but straightforward about, like, here's the situation for women in the United States, and it has not always been great. My birthday is August 26th, which is technically Women's Equality Day. So she would make Women's Equality Day cards for me for my birthday. But
Oh, I love that.
she made a point of pointing out that not every woman in the United States got the right to vote at that moment. And if we forget that, we do so at our peril, at our detriment. And it's not bad or wrong to have a full picture of your history and what got us to a place. Because if you don't have that information, that's when you need to worry.
Mhm.
Which is probably the longest answer I've ever given to like how my relationship with my brother was, but
No.
complex, but it just became more and more fulfilling as we grew.
But I think that that's why, like, just having met you literally moments ago, the term curiosity and curious keeps being brought up, and I can't help but feel for you when he did pass and you didn't have any answers. And if you're a curious person, you want to know what happened.
Yeah.
So what was that like, and what was going on in your mind when you weren't even 100% sure what was going on, if he had passed and you were over here so far away? What was going on?
It was a really strange day already. And I was in Seattle in the Pacific time zone. So for me, December 9th is when I found out. But December 10th technically is what the date was where he was. And that morning, my now ex-husband and I had gone to an optometrist to like order glasses, and it was just really innocuous. But I had my phone with me, and I was like keeping track of Grant's tweets because a game was happening.
Yeah.
I remember it was raining, kind of like miserable outside, but Grant stopped tweeting, which wasn't necessarily unusual because I figured, well, he's probably writing a story right now. And by this stage, with my husband, who's an amazing person, and I know it was difficult for him to even like bring it up, but I had just like thrown up my hands after a lot of like marriage counseling and attempts to a divorce. And then I got three text messages from Celine. The first one said, Grant has collapsed at the stadium. And even that didn't seem strange to me because Grant overworking himself was not an unusual occurrence. Grant not taking great care of himself while working a job was not unusual, even though he was a very like physically fit person. He was getting over what we thought was bronchitis, and then her follow-up message was they're giving him CPR, and then right after that, just a very short text message that said he's dead. And I just stared at that. And I remember I started screaming, and I had to grab a couch pillow because I didn't want my neighbors to freak out. And then stuff just kind of moved really fast. I did something like wildly out of character for me. I made a video of myself that I so like people say live without regrets. Regrets are like a powerful teacher sometimes.
Mhm.
I made a video and to put online, and I did, which is not something I ever do. Saying that I thought Grant had been killed, and at that time, like I had maybe like 1,000 people following me on Twitter, and almost all of them were people I knew or had worked with or knew of.
Like
Um,
personally, yeah.
yes, yeah. And I didn't even use my own name, so like someone had to know who I was to like figure things out. But it was an immediate emotional reaction because I had literally just been talking to my brother. He just had a birthday. It's not unusual for anybody with like a public face to get crazy emails and like even death threats and things. But he was telling me about some of the death threats he'd been getting that were like especially concerning. By this point, he had already had his whole experience wearing the rainbow soccer shirt, and he was writing a series of things very critical of the Qatari World Cup committee, and things that were happening to migrant workers there. And he had just told me about how while he was doing a podcast interview, some strange man had walked into the house he was sharing with some other journalists, and was just very casually walking around, and then just walked out, and how strange he thought that was. And so I reacted the way I reacted. And meanwhile, my phone is kind of blowing up as it would in a moment like that, and mainly family. And when I had like a moment, I told my husband, I said, like, I've got to delete that video. I just felt kind of hinky about it. And he looked up from his phone and he said, like, it doesn't matter. It's everywhere. And that was maybe like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And uh, it was a definite media education for me. And I'm glad that I didn't blame anyone directly. I'm so glad I didn't do that. But I got a lot of my own death threats, and that's not a comfortable place to be in. And I also had some very nice people reach out with higher profiles than I have, to give me some suggestions and some pointers. One of which was like to put your social media in your name, but for certain things, make them private.
Yeah.
I made my Instagram private because a couple of outlets had used the video without my permission, and I didn't really pay attention to media much after that, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't. I think sometimes for mental health reasons, you just need a break from the craziness, even if I had contributed to it. And but I stayed on Twitter in a very weird way. A positive byproduct of that day was the amount of support I got from people I didn't know me on Twitter, that actually really helped get me through stuff. And I was tweeting some things like as they were happening, like the whole process. And I think because I was just in sort of this weird kind of fugue state in my head, it just felt like I was reporting. And
That's kind of a beautiful sentiment to grant, though.
yeah, I think, and like Grant knew that I had lived and worked in the Middle East, and he knew that I didn't hate Muslims or Islam or anything like that. And I knew lots of LGBTQAI plus people in the Middle East and what their lives are like. And that was the main motivator for him wearing that shirt in the first place, was not like to embarrass people, which to me was a nice byproduct, but was to recognize that, like, while this glorious event that we all love is happening, there are people in the host country who can't even wear a shirt like this.
Yeah.
And he was highlighting hypocrisy, which was always an important thing for Grant to highlight whenever he could. And he would have said that he kind of violated a personal policy of his, like, to not be the story yourself. But it was a unique opportunity for him, and to raise awareness. He talked to me about wearing the rainbow soccer shirt before he did it. And at the time, I kind of encouraged him not to do it because I didn't want things to happen to my brother. But he had a noble reason for doing it. And I really appreciate it. And thinking about that, and I'm sitting in front of like a which you can't see, a giant flag of that rainbow soccer ball that I'm trying to like decrease. Is that a word? It is a word, but not for.
Yeah.
I need a steamer. I need to get a steamer.
Yes.
I'm going to be carrying it at the Pride Parade here in Kansas City. But exactly 1 year ago today, I flew to Kansas City to film for CBS Sports a piece for Pride, and it was at the Sporting Kansas City Pride match, and I had a version of this flag, and I wore the very shirt that Grant wore in Qatar, which I have in a frame now. But it is a culturally important thing in a lot of places in the Middle East to recognize anniversaries of important, like, emotional things in your lives. And today is one of those things, but it's a thing that I'm proud of. And I feel like I've aged about 20 years in the past year just from a lot of difficult experiences. Having to grieve publicly is a very strange thing. And I have had a lot of help from people about that, and I've learned a lot. Um, and for the most part, I would say, kind of as a self-protection module, I had to kind of develop a script, which is not, like, unusual because I would get a lot of the same questions, but
Right.
um, I was and some people might call it dissociation, I suppose, but I was able to kind of describe the events that happened around Grant's death, and in a way that allowed me to sort of be maybe 10 feet behind myself.
I was going to say, was that probably easier for you?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know how Celine was able to, go on CBS morning show and talk about these things. I don't think I could have done it. I don't think people realize how hard that is. And I don't excuse myself from like being part of this phenomenon sometimes too. It's so easy to see people like who are on television regularly, or on one or other of your screens on a regular basis, and think that things are necessarily difficult for them, or that they have emotions. And I know those things aren't easy for Celine, but there are people who can help you finesse those things.
Yeah.
And that's a whole world I wasn't aware of necessarily. And it was not an easy transition for me. And I found that I drew so much, initially to my surprise, I drew so much on my teacher's college experience and being in front of a classroom of people. I'm a pretty, like, twitchy, anxious person in general. I don't look like other people. I'm wiry, 6'5". Like, a friend of mine said once, like, my eyes were so deep set I could look backwards, and then like generations changed and nobody got my Yvonne Lendl jokes, and
Yeah.
but part and parcel with what we learned after Grant's death, especially thanks to the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, was that Grant had a rare, as of yet unnamed, genetic mutation. It's just FBN1 on the 15th chromosome, that at Celine's urging, I and other family members got tested for, and I learned that I have the same genetic mutation.
Mm.
And I mean, the positive is that I know what to do about it. And I know what to tell a cardiologist to look for instance, and would have had no idea if my brother had not passed away. Which is a strange headspace to be in also, but
In a way, he saved your life.
he did. Yeah. And I have learned so much about aortic aneurysms and aortic dissection, and have really felt, with the help of a lot of good people, better able to talk about these things publicly, and to appreciate my brother publicly, and to thank people publicly for their recognition of his talent and skills. and got involved with the John Ritter Foundation for Aortic Health. Yeah, incredibly nice people. And feel like I've been able to channel a lot of this rangy emotional mess into something positive and productive and helpful, and it helps me too. Um, but is a way to keep Grant's name in the conversation in a variety of beneficial ways, not just his appreciation of sports and people at every economic level's involvement in it, but pretty compelling reasons why sports and politics like do have a pretty fundamental relationship. Um, a lot of people don't know that his degree from Princeton was in political science, and so like it interfamilially, we would often laugh when he would get those like "shut up and dribble" type comments from people who didn't know like you don't have to have a degree from Princeton in political science to have an opinion about this or to see what's going on, but it doesn't hurt. And I think the big challenge for Grant was trying to get people to see those links in a way that we could ask ourselves, regardless of where we are on the political spectrum, what can be done?
Mhm.
Or like, wow, this person went through hell and high water to get where they are, and that's something to shout about. And then how do you use that position to help other people? Um, and so in a kind of tangential way, I feel like I've become part of that through unfortunate happenstance, but it's helping me as well.
And it's such a unique relationship that you have with the media because you talk about at the beginning, he's part of the media and you're always, reading his tweets, which is such a beautiful sentiment to him. I wish my brother was always on top of everything I reported on, but that's neither here nor there. But then you also talk about as time went on, you can just tell like you're developing a certain relationship with the media. And you even said when you were staying with Celine, you guys didn't watch the news. It was something that you couldn't do. Why did you try to avoid the news, but also with that relationship that you also had to embrace it because he was a member of the media?
I'm not sure I 100% know an answer to that yet. I can tell you that I am a very private person by nature, and it comes from growing up the way I did, getting made fun of a lot for just being myself and feeling like in those cultural moments that there was something wrong with me. Um, and so it confused a lot of people who knew me well that I wanted to go into teaching. But when I would stand up in front of a class, and I totally see why seems contradictory given my nature, but I was in a kind of like autopilot mode because I loved my subject, which was English and creative writing. And doing that gave me a sense of purpose and then showed me in very immediate ways that like it's like a Shakespeare play. And if you're like an actor, and I have actor friends who tell me this a lot, like most of the audience doesn't know if you flubbed your line. And I used to hate the phrase "fake it till you make it" when I was growing up. I'm like, until I started realizing like, oh my God, they have no idea that like inside I am like shivering. And little by little, I think that's how confidence develops.
Mhm.
And that is something that transcends subject matter, that transcends uh, jobs, because I've now developed relationships with coaches and players across a variety of sports who have experienced some form of that themselves. And I can relate that to being a graduate student. It's like, I do really well at this. I'm going to keep doing this because this makes me feel good because, oh, I do well at this.
Mhm.
And when I first started graduate school, I was terrified because, you go into a college course and you get a syllabus, and it's like a hit parade of like everything I'm terrified of. Like, how on earth am I going to, like, I'm not smart enough to do this. And so I had my head down for like the entire first semester. And I got straight A's. But it wasn't until the end of that first semester that I went out with my other colleagues, the other grad students, and I just volunteered, thank you, beer, that like I was terrified. I thought I didn't belong here. I thought everyone was smarter than I was. And I found out that every single other person thought exactly the same thing. And then I sort of had like recalculate how I thought about my talents, my abilities, and how different sometimes what people are seeing is from what I'm feeling inside when I'm like delivering information.
Mm.
And I, I heard back when Grant died from exactly one U.S. men's national team player. And at the time I was kind of salty about that. It's like, why is no one reaching out to me? But then like most of them didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
Or if they did, they just knew like, oh, crazy video guy. And which, not great, but this particular person was just like super nice and said, look, here's what I would recommend. And this person never met me personally and had no need to do this, but chose to. And that meant a lot to me. And little by little in the years since Grant's death, I would meet a lot of people with more public profiles in sports. And I would come to see them far more than just the people that I watched on television or listened to on podcasts. And so many people who had Grant stories that were similar. And from journalists too, like, the first time I met Grant, I realized I was seated next to him at like my first game that I was covering, and like how terrified they were. And then at halftime, and I've heard this from multiple people, at halftime, instead of like diving into his own work, Grant asked them what they thought,
Wow.
and wanted to know. And that I know for Grant, because he'd talk about it, it was very important for him to know what people starting out thought about things and how they were thinking about things. And because that's really how Grant, from our little ranch house in Mission, Kansas, got into sports. He really did write a letter in 6th grade to Sports Illustrated, and he heard back. And even though it was like one of those kind of like, oh, isn't that cute, kind of
Yeah.
notes, like that just like flipped a switch in him and made him think like, maybe I can do this. And sometimes that's all it takes. And so like even when I would go to like awards things that were sometimes somber, I remember being at the Soccer Hall of Fame class of 23 induction ceremony in Frisco, Texas. And some people who I never would have walked up to myself because they were soccer, capital S people, who came up to me and just relayed some really amazing stories. Or would say like, Grant could have written this thing about me, which would have been true and would have ruined my life, and he didn't. And how much they respected that, because that wasn't the story that Grant was wanting to tell. And Grant gave people room to be themselves. And I think he made people comfortable once they realized that he was in earnest, because sometimes people think like, oh, here's this Princeton guy from New York coming and he's got an angle. And then they would meet Grant and he would kind of be a dork sometimes.
Yeah.
And Grant was aware of this, but like at a certain point, like whoever he was talking to who was maybe wary would realize. And there are certain interviews where I swear you can see this on their face when it hits them, like, oh my God, he's really like this. Like he really is just earnest. And he's not working an angle. he was really good at making people feel comfortable being themselves and sharing their view of the world the way they knew it, and not, well, and being curious rather than judgmental, uh,
Mhm.
as Ted Lasso would say.
And when I hear stories about him from players, former players, that's what I hear the most about him was he was charismatic. There wasn't an angle all the time. And rightfully there were. Like when you're a journalist, you have to have one because that's how you create these stories. And but he would just, text some of the players, when a certain thing would happen in their lives. And and that's such a unique part of what his craft was. So, did you think that was kind of unique because he was able to be charismatic and he was trusting and he was able to have these people open up to them, up to him? Was he always like that?
Um, Mainly,
Mm,
uh, I there, and I've thought a lot about this, um, because I was determined, that I was gonna write about Grant and our family that we didn't realize was as unique as it was when we were growing up, and grief. And it's taking me longer than I thought it would. I've kept a journal since 1995, so there's a lot of stuff to wade through, and sometimes it's really emotional, and I just kind of have to take a week,
mhm,
um, and because I had forgotten things. But like anybody, Grant grew and evolved, and there was a period kind of post Princeton at which I would say, like, our mom and dad had a kind of come to Jesus moment, with Grant, and I was involved as well, because mom thought that Grant was being kind of a snob.
mm,
Um, and I don't know what sparked it. It was probably like a collection of little things. And Grant reacted really defensively at first, but I suppose anybody would if your family is suddenly saying, I think perhaps you are not, Smedley Roquefort the third, and acting like you are is not great for you. But he did think about it. It definitely stuck in his craw. And he kind of evolved out of that when he got the feedback. If he cared about you, he wanted your feedback. And
mm,
if you like came to Grant in earnest, he respected that. And there were definitely times in which Grant, like after reflecting about something, um, I wish I knew more people who were like this. Would say, I thought about this and I talked to some other people and I was wrong. And thank you. Uh, and and that kind of thing, I credit our parents for it, and our dad, who was a high school government and sociology teacher in Kansas City, Kansas, for 29 years, trying to get us to see and appreciate complexity. It's very easy to see complexity in all of its forms as overwhelming,
mhm,
um, and boy, I've fallen into that too. But um, if you have the luxury of the time to look at something and to study something, whether it's people or a phenomena, um, and course correct. And if you are in earnest when you tell people, I've acquired new information and I feel differently now, um, that's a gift. It's also kind of a spark for change. And when Grant started realizing that he could do this in his writing, um, I think he changed along with that. Um, there's a story that he co-wrote early on in his career with Sports Illustrated, about some really awful hazing that was happening, in a high school wrestling program.
mm,
Um, and uh, and he talked to me while he was working on this about interviewing some of these high school guys that had terrible things happen to them, and realizing that there was a lot of responsibility in what he was writing about, and how that was affecting him. And like, this is going in a national magazine and people are going to see this, and this is going to affect their lives. Um, And he wanted to do that with a lot of sensitivity that I think we don't immediately think of when we think of sports journalism.
Mhm.
But those stories are out there asking to be told. And if you let yourself be overwhelmed by the complexity and the potentials of all the things that could happen, it's going to be a lot harder to get out of the starting gate. And for me, when I think, like, even talking about that right now, that was just part of a regular conversation I had with Grant, and like reflecting on it from a distance just reminds me of how lucky I was, I think,
Mhm.
to have that person in my life, and to have that person's life color so many things about my own.
And I love that he was sensitive to the fact that, like, what he was doing was there were consequences to it.
Yeah.
Some positive, some negative, and I don't and you're right. When we think of sports journalism, we think of silliness sometimes,
Yeah.
or who cares? It's just sports, which is
Yeah.
very
And
difficult to get out of that.
I don't necessarily knock that. I think I've definitely had times in my life where I've been grateful for sports to take my mind off of other
Yeah.
things. So even when somebody has that kind of shut up and dribble mentality, even if it's annoying to me in a lot of ways, I also totally get where that comes from. Like, being a spectator is also a refuge for a lot of
Mhm.
people. And that refuge, it maybe even call it a safe space if you want, but uh, that refuge gets kind of like called into question when like the people around me aren't all on the same page, or I
Yeah.
don't think they are, right? And then for some people, it makes it harder for them to feel like they can enjoy that refuge. And I think I think we ignore those sentiments at our own peril too. I don't have to agree with someone um, to try to understand why they're reacting the way they are, or to even not want politics and sports to be like commingled. But
Mhm.
um, we create what feel like bubbles for ourselves sometimes out of necessity, and I don't expect everybody to be super self-aware when it's just something they enjoy.
Yeah.
Um, I like I like butter on my popcorn at the movies. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about why.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like if I'm trying to buy buttered popcorn and there's like people protesting off to the side because this, palm oil situation here or that, and like I suppose it depends on the day. I might be like, "Oh,
Yeah.
shut up." But I also be like, what is this about? I need to know more
Yeah.
about this. And it doesn't make the people protesting necessarily bad or wrong. Um, or my desire to just like have a break. I think those are all valid things, and I would so love for us as a country to be able to like take a breath
Yeah.
and be able to say like, let's look at the stuff that we enjoy together and why we enjoy these things together, and maybe like this complexity can be something that makes us stronger instead of so at odds with each other. Because yeah, sports are enjoyable, but there are serious stories in sports, and people knock themselves out to be good at sports. People
Yeah.
knock themselves out to be successful coaching at sports, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
And when I was a teenager, I would have written all this off as just like I did not care about sports because I didn't feel like that was in an arena that invited me.
Yeah.
Um, and so I did very solitary things like running track, and biking, and things that I could just sort of like blinder myself into. But I also grew up in a household that like sports was on that television regardless of like what time of year it was. And so I can't say that like I had no awareness of it or wanted no part of it. Um, I'm like, upon reflection, super happy to have been a kid in the 70s because we got like absolutely banana stuff like Battle of the Network Stars. And trying to explain that to kids today is something else.
Yeah.
And maybe I wasn't always watching it for the competition aspect. Maybe I wanted to see Greg Evigan in, a Speedo, but it it or you'd have like very charismatic sports commentators. Um, And like I realize in hindsight, this whole like kind of internal hall of fame of sports commentators I grew up with on television. Um, and like I can conjure their voices. Um, but I know some of their stories too, because our mom was a big sports person. And at the time, if you just had 3 channels on your television, and you wanted to watch women's sports, it was going to be the LPGA, or tennis, or if you were lucky every 4 years, you got to see something else on the Olympics. But when there were more and more women sports commentators, we knew their names and we were
Mhm.
supposed to like call mom from whatever room she was in to let her know, like Phyllis George is on the television, Leslie Visser was on the television. And we felt like we had this weird sort of relationship with these people on our
Yeah.
television. And that phenomenon has not changed. In fact, it's probably, like metastasized, that people think because you're on my phone every day, that I have some kind of relationship with you. And
There's access there.
and therefore I can say whatever I want to you.
Yep.
And it's a double-edged sword. But I've been able to like grow into an appreciation of sports, particularly soccer, because of the work that was important to Grant, because it was a way for me to be closer to Grant. Um, and having just narrated the audiobook of his anthology that's coming out on the 4th, reminded me of a lot of great journalism, but also just the sheer amount of ground that book covers, and the way Grant approached things. And it's a really great primer if you ever want to like have a conversation with somebody about like sports and politics actually do have a lot to do with each other. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with right or left. But Grant shows you like by giving us people's stories, and in some of the like best journalistic ways, leaves the conclusion up to the reader, but has shown you what someone has gone through in in the context of a sport that we love.
And I want to talk about the book, but before I get there, please, people, if you're listening to this, don't ruin movie theater popcorn for me. I don't want to know what's in it. I don't want to know what's in the butter. I don't want to know.
I love a good Cheeto. That was some of the best stuff that's orange that was invented in a lab ever, and like I'm happy not knowing.
Me too. Like the runny nacho cheese, I
Mm.
know it's not good for me, but I need it. So I love that. With this book, World Class Purpose, Passion, and the Pursuit of Greatness on and off the Field, it's a collection of Grant's work from throughout his career. You're reading a lot. Are you doing all the audio?
It is a unique audiobook. So I
Okay.
am reading every one of Grant's pieces,
Mhm.
and then the colophon and stuff like that, which is a unique experience. And then having to note that the audio was done by myself.
Mhm.
Uh, but Celine, my sister-in-law, Grant's wife, wrote the foreword, so she is narrating that. And then Alexandra Wolf and Mark Mravich also narrate their contributions. There's a great intro piece by Alexandra Wolf, but they each have their own introductions to each of Grant's pieces to place them in kind of a socio-historical context. So all 4 of us appear on the audiobook.
Amazing. And what was that process like? Because you were talking a little bit about how it was cathartic. You truly felt him when you were reading some of these.
Good.
So overall, how was that process and what was emotional about it?
Um, It was fascinating. I was hella nervous at first,
Yeah.
but and learned a ton. I think my number one takeaway was that for whatever scientific reason, and I'm gonna find out, Granny Smith apples are phenomenal at combating
Yes,
vocal
moisture.
issues.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's just some kind of like urban legend. But oh my gosh, I am an absolute convert. Um, and so I went to a studio here in Kansas City, where I'm proud to say William Shatner also recorded.
Oh,
I felt something there, and I'm because
yeah.
I'm a huge Trekkie, but and we also had a director in New York, who was patched in, and some of these essays I remember Grant talking to Grant while he was working on them, um, and and he and I used to joke because my background is very like English teachery, and then my graduate degrees are like in creative nonfiction and fiction writing. So my approach to writing and what a paragraph should look like is totally different than what you're writing for a magazine. And I could hear myself, like, I read some things out loud that I remember, like, cracking on Grant for, not because they weren't well done, but because they were so opposite from what I would tell a student to do in a paper, for instance. And I read one particular sentence that, good Lord, it seemed to go on forever. And I could hear myself telling Grant, like, "You have not met a run-on sentence that
Where's
you
the comma, man? Where are
like,
you?
yeah. I was halfway into this sentence, not even halfway done yet, and I'm thinking, wasn't this about something else when you started? But this is like the mile-long sentence. But Grant would get, what do you think about me saying this? Grant would get so in love with his own prose sometimes that he would actually like stand up and he had this kind of vocal tick. It's kind of a self-satisfied vocal tick. He'd just go, "Heh." And then he would like call me or email me or probably tell Celine and just like read it back. And invariably, like Celine or I would be like, "Are you gonna print that?" Because there's like one phrase that he was just like so in love with. Um, and so it was not uncommon for him to kind of like go toe to toe with editors to fight for like a phrase or something like that. But like the process of reading these stories made me really proud. Um, but it was definitely by the end a cathartic feeling. Like um, I'm contributing to my brother's legacy in a way that I think would make him very happy, and um, just being part of the entire process, and being allowed to like make suggestions for things that I thought should be in the book, and um, and there are some amazing pieces in the book, and it closes out on some of his dispatches from Qatar. Um, which were harder for me to read. That was a hard day.
Yeah.
We wanted to get those out like as quickly as we could because we knew that they'd be emotional. But completing it and having very few what they call pickups, which is like going in to re-record something, um, made me feel good.
Yeah.
But also like hearing this person who I knew of at Penguin, who was our producer, director, um, give me really positive feedback about the whole experience. Um, doing something I'd never thought about was really satisfying in a way that I'm still trying to find the words for, I guess. But I think in whatever format people access this amazing book, um, I think there's a lot of just Grant in it being himself and showing us what was important to him, and um, I'm really proud of it.
And audio's June 4th, and the paperback is June
Um,
8th.
no, I think both laydowns are for the 4th.
Okay.
And yeah, it's a simultaneous release, and we've had some great responses from people who've seen advanced copies of it. For me, seeing positive praise for the book from people like Megan Rapinoe and LeBron, who was always just an important person to Grant as a human being. I think Grant felt a lot of responsibility for putting his name out there and him being so young, and that can sometimes put a lot of pressure on a kid who's just trying to be good at sports for himself and his family. And so to get the positive response that we got from LeBron was really important to
The
me.
guy who has the chosen one on his back as a tattoo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure I'll be like nervous on the 4th, but um, I'm mainly proud.
Mhm. And so before I let you go, I don't know what happens when you die, but the one thing I'm guaranteed and sure of, just death has happened in my family so much, is people miss you when you pass. And I listened to this podcast. It was actually Grant, the football with Grant Wahl, and the producer Chris Whittingham, former producer for him, I guess you should say, said this about Grant. He was kind. That's just what he did. That's who he was. And to simplify who he was in those few words, that's got to feel really amazing.
Um, yeah, I love Chris, and they had something really special with that podcast, and um, all of that um, keeps Grant close to my heart, and I think our ability to be able to share that with other people, um, especially people who are maybe thinking they want to go into sports journalism the way Grant did, but aren't aren't sure they can swing it. Um, Proceeds from this book are going to go to a scholarship fund um, that is very much in the manner of something that helped Grant when he was an undergrad be able to make his first trip to Buenos Aires and start writing about soccer. Um, that was something that was really in the front of the minds of all of us who helped put the book together. Um, and I can't wait to meet the new journalists who are going to take that mantle.
Amazing. Eric, thanks so much for your time. This was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Just my pleasure.
That was Eric. It was such a beautiful conversation because I didn't really even need to be a part of it. The way that Eric speaks about himself and Grant, the relationship they had, the relationship Grant had with sports media is so powerful and important. And I'm glad Eric brought up the fact that there's a balance of sports journalism. Let's be honest, I'm not curing cancer. That's just not the case. I'm not solving world hunger. I'm tweeting about baseball and talking about baseball and doing a sports podcast. But this podcast is super important to me because we do get to talk about these things. Death is very important to me. Talked about it before. Both my parents are gone. I have my best friend passed away last year, my childhood best friend. My uncle just passed away recently. It's one of those things that you have to deal with in life. And all we have left is the memories of them. Like I said to Eric, we don't know what happens when we're gone, but I certainly know that people miss the hell out of us. And I know there's a lot of people who miss the hell out of Grant. So thank you, Eric, for your time. And thanks for tuning in to Short and to the Point on the Comeback and Awful Announcing. And we'll see you next time.
Want even more short and to the point? Follow Jessica at Kleinschmidt JD and head over to thecomeback.com and awfulannouncing.com.